Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I feel so blessed to be here and join with you, Unity San Jose. What a beautiful day. So let's dive into suffering. I guess we don't hear that too frequently, right? Let's dive into suffering, but let's do it. I'm going to begin with a story, and it comes from a book entitled "Who Ordered This Truckload of Dung?" It's inspiring stories for welcoming life's difficulties. So there's a man being chased by a tiger in the jungle, and the tiger was hungry and the man was in trouble. And so with the tiger almost upon him, the man saw a well by the side of the path. And so in desperation, he leapt in. And as soon as he had committed himself to the leap, he saw what a big mistake he had made, because at the bottom of the well, there was a big coil of black snake. So instinctively, his arm reached for the side of the well where his hand found a root of a tree attached. And so the root checked his fall. And when he had gathered all of his senses, he looked down to see that the snake was right there near his feet. And he looked up to see the tiger was leaning right over the well, trying to paw him from above. And then, as he contemplated this dire predicament, two mice emerged and started chewing on the root that he was hanging from. So as the tiger was attempting to paw the man, its hindquarters were rubbing against the small tree that he was latched onto. It was shaking. And so then all of a sudden, honey began to drop into the well. The man put his tongue out and caught the honey. There was a beehive right above him. He said, that tastes so good. And he smiled. And so this Zen story, as it's traditionally told, it usually ends right there, as it's true to life. Life doesn't always have a neat ending. Life is forever in the process of completion. And a lot of times we are caught between a hungry tiger and a big black snake, or between, seemingly other extremes, while the mice are chewing away at our grip on life, so to speak. So the author decided to give the story an ending, though, in order to make a point. And so he said, as the man was enjoying the honey, the mice were chewing on the root thinner and thinner, and the black snake was there stretching closer and closer, and the tiger was leaning in. And then the tiger leaned too far, tumbled into the well, missed the man, crushed the snake, and they were both there at their death. And so he said, well, it could happen, and something in life unexpectedly usually does happen, even when we're in those moments. And so why waste time when we can just be tasting the honey? And I like that story, because we can all relate to those moments where we just seem so consumed by what's going on in the outer appearances of life and the predicaments we may find ourselves in, that we forget to taste the honey. We forget to even notice that there's honey dripping. And so this is a little bit about the suffering and pain. Pain comes fast and furious sometimes. Sometimes it can feel like a bee sting, and then it swells and festers up, or it can be a jolt of pain, like a 2x4 to our skull, knock us clean out. I think I've been there before. It can be a hot rush of blood into our head or our heart when emotional pain sweeps through our body and just sort of takes over. And maybe it's a photo we look at. Maybe it's a song we hear, a voice, a memory that just comes in seemingly out of left field and pulls deeply at our heartstrings. And we can't help if the tears well up. And the pain might come in physical form, emotional, mental. So the quote from my talk today, my talk title, comes from this entire quote: pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. And so this quote has been attributed to many people, the Dalai Lama, a handful of other sages and others. And we don't really know who first shared the quote, but we recognize that there's wisdom in it, because pain is a part of the universal human experience. And I believe it interests us all to explore the journey of pain and suffering from a spiritual lens, because we can take a different look at suffering. So there's a story in one of Eckhart Tolle's books, and it's about two ducks who get into a duck fight. And they're intense and they're violent. They're just in this duck fight for a few seconds, and then they part, just sort of shaking off this argument, flapping their wings. And suddenly all the intensity of that fight releases, and life returns to normal. They have no stories, no name calling, no hurt egos, and no suffering. Ducks. A friend shared with me a story one time. He took his dog to the veterinarian and he started thinking about it after the visit. He said to the vet, I've noticed when a dog is injured, like if it's hit by a car, it will yelp, it will run off to a safe spot, it will sort of whimper and then calm down, regardless of the severity of the injury. And it won't go on, whining or crying like humans. And the vet said, well, that's because animals don't feel sorry for themselves. And so we humans, because we have thoughts and we strongly identify with our thoughts, our minds allow us to live beyond the present moment and beyond the present circumstances. So we can be reliving the injury, the insult, the grievance over and over again. We're susceptible to retelling painful events of our past and, furthermore, anticipating the terrible misfortunes that could possibly happen in the future. So at this point, I think being a duck or a dog sounds more and more pleasant. Sometimes the human experience isn't so peaceful. So I feel that there is so much left on this topic of suffering to interpretation and much to explore with varying thoughts. So we'll just start with the basics. The dictionary offers this simplistic definition: to undergo or feel pain or distress, to sustain injury, and to endure pain. So Alan Watts, he once shared an illustration, and he pointed out that the snake bite never killed anyone. Yes, it hurts. Yes, there's pain, but it's the venom. It's the venom that's released after the snake bite that destroys the outer membrane of the capillary vessels, causing internal bleeding and paralysis and other things that can be fatal. So I'm thinking about this scene. The venom releasing is equivalent to the damage that we can do to ourselves and our minds, creating a torturous environment, sometimes actually even bringing people to their last breath. So suffering, in that space of suffering, it causes or forces our focus to turn inward to that raw and real emotion that we might otherwise ignore, stuff down, or distract doing something else. So perhaps suffering can lead to less suffering if we learn the art of suffering. So maybe we become more compassionate and more resilient through our suffering. There's a saying, it's not good to bite, but it's good to be bitten. So then suddenly when we're bitten, all that's been buried is sort of ejected, it comes out, and we can become masterful with this excavation of what's sort of buried. I once listened to a talk that Thich Nhat Hanh shared about the art of suffering. And somebody asked the question, he said, why do people have to suffer? And this is what he said. He said, because suffering and happiness are a part of life. Suffering and happiness have to be together. This is a very deep teaching of the Buddha. It's like the left and the right. The left is there, the right must be there also. And if there is no left, there cannot be a right. To grow lotus flowers, you need mud. Suffering is the mud, and the lotus is happiness. The mud does not smell good, but the lotus flowers smell very good. If you know how to make good use of the mud, you can grow a beautiful lotus. If you know how to make good use of suffering, you can create happiness. If we know the art of suffering, we will suffer much less. We will suffer only a little, and we will use our mud to grow our lotus flowers. Suffering is useful because when you look deeply at suffering, you understand, and suddenly compassion and love are born in you. So suffering is not entirely negative. It's helpful like the mud. When you grow vegetables organically, you don't throw the garbage away. You make it into compost to nourish flowers and vegetables. It's the same with suffering. You transform suffering into compost that grows the flowers of happiness. So I'm kind of going down the Buddhist path with the suffering talk because there's so much talk in Buddhism about suffering. And the Buddha said, I teach one thing, and I teach one thing only, and that is suffering and the end of suffering. So in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths are all about suffering. The first noble truth is the idea that everyone suffers, and that suffering is a part of the world. This refers to physical, emotional discomfort and pain that all humans experience in their lives. The second noble truth is the concept that something causes suffering to happen. The Buddha believed that most suffering is caused by a tendency to crave or desire things. Buddhism teaches that through being dissatisfied with our lives, craving things or people, then people suffer. This refers to suffering that arises from the inability to accept change. People cling to experiences, places, people, and cannot accept that truth of impermanence. And then so here suffering is created by that craving. And the third noble truth is knowing that suffering can end. Here there is a recognition that there's a way to stop suffering and move away from it, because by doing this, people can get closer to reaching enlightenment. And that is an end to craving, is an end to suffering. And the fourth noble truth is that there's a way to end suffering, that there are many things to end suffering, such as following the Buddha's teachings and meditating. The Buddha also taught that people should live the middle way. This is a path that falls between two extremes. Another term for the middle way is the Noble Eightfold Path, which consists of 8 steps to end suffering. So we'll come back to the Eightfold Path as a guide out of suffering, but first I wanted to dive deeper into suffering. So I might personally name suffering as a separation from God, from source, God mind, a moment that we forget that we're co-creators in the divine plan, and that all circumstances are here for our good, for our growth. And no matter how seemingly outrageous or horrendous the outer appearances show up. So I feel that the talks of Beelzebub's Tales by John Bennett really help distinguish 4 types of suffering. The first is unnecessary suffering, and this would be the type of suffering that we incur because of our unreasonable attitudes and expectations towards others. Maybe feelings of ill will, rejection of others, possessiveness, arrogance, things like that. So in other words, our suffering arises from what I call our small S self. It's usually where the ego wants to keep score and take names. And the second is unavoidable suffering. This would be the type of suffering that comes to us by accident, from events beyond our control, such as interpersonal conflicts, war, disaster, disease, death, things we don't really plan for. They show up. Third, we have voluntary suffering, and this would be the type of suffering that we take upon ourselves in order to accomplish a personal aim, such as maybe an athlete who disciplines himself to win, gets up at 4 a.m. and goes swimming, or a student who stays up all night laboring to get good grades. And then the final type of suffering is intentional suffering, and according to Bennett, this would be the kind of suffering that we would take upon ourselves in order to accomplish an altruistic goal, one that is directed more towards service to others, not for any personal gain. So I think for the most part, when we talk about suffering is optional, we're referring to unnecessary and unavoidable suffering. But it may not always be true if someone is conditioned to say, like, adhere to voluntary suffering to accomplish something, and they might not recognize that it's a program or a pattern. And so that's why they're doing it, and they don't realize that they're suffering. But that's not, I don't think, what we're talking about for the most part. So this is suffering, and you can see how multi-layered and multifaceted this topic can be. And so staying in curiosity is always my favorite answer. And with that, I know that there's two pieces of news about suffering, good news and bad news. And the bad news is that we're the creators of our suffering. And the good news is that we're the creators of our suffering. Muji, who's a mystic, he said something I really liked. He said, it's not that you're experiencing suffering, you're suffering your experience. So I think it's fair to say that it isn't really an either or topic. There's a difference between a knock at the door with a letter from the IRS and a knock at the door to announce the death of a loved one. So we must have grace, compassion, and gentleness with ourselves for whatever is showing up in our lives. And I believe that there is a difference between sadness and sorrow and suffering. And I think that perhaps suffering meaning like this outright agony, a relentless torment, can move us into sadness or sorrow. So it can be a progression of sorts, like using the mud to grow the lotus. So this quote, suffering is optional. I want to name that part of the optional piece is that if you don't realize you're suffering, then it's probably safe to say it's not optional. We can think of times in our life when we've suffered because we just didn't know a way out. We may have been a child, we may have been in middle school, we may have been in a marriage when we were younger, in addiction, whatever the case may be, we may have not had the awareness, the tools, a process, or rituals to guide us out of that depth of despair. Often people find themselves in a metaphysical teachings after suffering in a religion or a belief system that didn't serve their highest and best, and they're seeking out something that feels safe. So we've ended up here at Unity San Jose Spiritual Center, and so I'm speaking to those who have some level of awareness and can to some degree identify suffering. This isn't the case for everybody. So with that said, we all can be activated out of nowhere with something that touched us so deeply. It could rip right to our raw center, and we get the opportunity to find our way back to the truth of our divine nature and grow a lotus flower. So I'd like to lean into the spiritual lens here. The word spiritual has the word ritual in it. And for me, a ritual can be a resource, a reminder to return to the truth of our wholeness. So when we're suffering or feeling any upset, for that matter, returning to our center of truth and divinity is what our journey here on earth is all about. We can draw on that ritual part of spiritual when the wolf comes to the door, when the things show up. Otherwise, in those moments, we can get easily caught into old patterns of reaction, and then we can just perpetuate suffering. Maybe it's replaying dark and dreary songs of days gone by, or self-pity or victim mentality about how we were done wrong, or self-loathing, or beating ourselves up violently and relentlessly. We have a track record for that as human beings, giving ourselves no mercy occasionally. So I've used a practice over the years that I've referred to simply as notice, recognize, release. And now that it's been nearly 2 decades that I've been using it, I think to myself, I might have come up with something a little snazzier or a fun acronym, but nevertheless, it's been a solid spiritual practice for me. And the first portion is notice. So notice when you're activated and that the suffering is causing you agony and overwhelm. These can be even just little things. We can be suffering. Just somebody said that to us in the store and be just replaying it all day. We continue in a state of suffering then. So we can ask, do we want to shift to a distraction of vice and addiction, or do you want to feel it and move through it consciously? Moving through it, not just shifting out by a spiritual bypass where we just sort of bury it down, but actually allowing it to move through by feeling it. So the notice part is about knowing what you want. Here we can use the question, do I want to be right, or do I want to have peace? Maybe we create a safe word or a phrase for ourselves to come back to when we're so upset. Perhaps there's a question that we might ask. The first step here when we're activated is usually to regulate our nervous system and get us out of that fight flight response. And we can do this by taking deep diaphragmatic breaths. This belly breathing involves fully engaging our stomach, our abdominal muscles, and this helps us kind of regulate, come back to center. So this needs to happen before we can tune into that safe word or a safe mantra or something like that. So the second piece is recognize. So we go into recognize that you can't stand this anymore. It's not worth the perpetual agony. It's not worth allowing that venom to, take over your body. Recognize that this doesn't feel good. You might ask God, your higher self, what is the source of my torment? Is it the snake bite or the venom? Show me, God, what is my highest good here? Recognize, recognize back to your divine state of being. And then finally, release. So back to the ritual part of spirituality and the Eightfold Path for rituals to release. Ask for divine guidance to clear the path. Clear your path in this moment. Many moons ago, I heard Michael Beckwith share a story about finding himself in a strong current in the ocean, and he was exhausting himself, attempting to swim to shore, and he was unsuccessful. And I don't remember all the details of the story, but what I do remember is that he surrendered. He surrendered to the current. Obviously, he made it back. And what I remember is that he began a mantra, and his mantra was help, HELP. And he was repeating this: holy, eternal, loving presence. It's been really powerful for me over the years. I've shared it with my children years ago. And recently my daughter, who's 23, told me, I still use that, Mom. So go into some place where it can remind you that you're not alone, that there's just this amazing source energy always supporting you. So release the suffering into the surrender of the waves of life, and allow the holy, eternal, loving presence to carry you ashore in those moments. How can we remind ourselves that we are not the suffering and allow our higher self to lead us through? If we have these daily rituals that we're accustomed to, then when the suffering shows up, it arises, we're better equipped to return to center and remember our divinity. It's like storing up in a bank account and make a withdrawal when you need it. Okay, so we'll share the Buddhist Eightfold Path, which can be used to cultivate practices. And I've added my thoughts to the Eightfold Path here. So the first one is right view. And I will call this God mind or divine perception or perspective. A Course in Miracles describes a miracle as a shift in perception. So we can just ask, what lens are we viewing from? Number 2 is right resolve. And I look at this as nurturing ourselves through such a time. Self-care can include not creating more suffering for ourselves, by lashing out, regretting what we've said later. Maybe we turn to exercise or communing with nature. Maybe it's a modality that brings you resolve, like EFT or breath work, or gentle movement like yoga. Creating a safe and tender space for yourself to come into that resolve is important. Number 3 of the Eightfold Path is right speech. And I would say that this speaks to thought held in our mind create our reality. Our thoughts often come out in our speech. So divisive or abusive speech will yield the energetic match. So be mindful what we're energizing. You've heard at a magic show the announcement abracadabra. And abra is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew avra, meaning I will create, while kadabra is the Aramaic equivalent of the Hebrew kedubar, which means as was spoken. So together, the phrase means I will create as has been spoken, as the rabbit gets pulled out of the hat. So we can ask ourselves, what is our announcement to the world? What is our abracadabra? Number 4 is right action. And this speaks to our awareness that through our thoughts, words, actions, we live the truth we know. So while suffering, we might be in the why me space, and we can begin to ask for the truth to be revealed to us. Back to my second step, recognize, show me what is for my highest good. And perhaps why not me? This might be the place for journaling, connecting with a support system, a friend, therapist, sponsor, someone who will remind you of your truth, not someone who will commiserate and perpetuate the suffering with you. So number 5 is right livelihood, and number 6 is right effort. And for me, these both mean that our essence is of God, remembering and living the truth that the power and the presence of that mighty source is active in, through, and as you, as me, as we. It shows up in our work, our effort, our every breath, and it shows up even in our suffering. So number 7 is right mindfulness, being mindful of one's body, feelings, mind, mental qualities. We gain clarity about this when we're nourishing and nurturing ourselves. Our mind is affected by our gut. Our gut is affected by what we consume in our bellies. This is very profound. I remember once, after basically fasting for 5 days, eating only leek soup and water, my eyes were the clearest I'd ever seen them. My mind felt like just an open sky. I was pretty bewildered because I'm one to eat typically pretty clean diet, but even still, I experienced such a profound difference in my body, mind, and my soul. And so we know that body, mind, and soul work in conjunction. And so taking care of this vessel of ours is so vital. Another thing I've used over the years are ancient mantras. Very, very soothing, very centering. One of my favorites is Ong Namo Gurudev Namo, and it translates to I bow to the creative wisdom, I bow to the divine teacher within me. So we can use this ancient wisdom as rituals in our life to bring us back to center, out of suffering, to create that lotus. And finally, number 8, right concentration. So Buddhism talks about practicing skillful meditation, and that's informed by all the preceding 7 aspects of this path. And daily meditation, of course, as we know, isn't just checking off the box on the to-do list. It's actually setting the time of deep communion each day. I believe our lives are a prayer. Everything we say, everything we do, every breath we take. And so affirmative prayer is affirming in all moments, tuning into the truth that already lives within us. It's about returning to wholeness, a return to knowing that life is working out for us. And the universe has our backs, as Gabby Bernstein might say. So, when that 2x4 comes clocking you over the head, your daily practices will help you draw on the strength to rise. When we fill our toolbox with these rituals, may they be the Eightfold Path, ancient mantras, modalities that resonate for you, praying, meditating, we will be equipped with the rain jackets and the umbrellas and the flashlights and the waterproof blankets, all the reinforcement we need when the storm shows up. So again, the spiritual teacher Mooji says that the body can be hurt, but it's the mind that suffers. It's a pain and pleasure body, Eckhart Tolle talks about. And suffering has emotional and psychological qualities, and therefore Mooji feels that it's optional. He says that it's an option how we see our pain and how we meet our pain. He says it's not that you're experiencing the suffering, you are suffering, you're experiencing. And it's not that you are experiencing suffering because there's nothing called suffering, but you are suffering in the way that you're experiencing it. And understanding this is where the lotus can emerge from the mud. We are the marble and the sculptor, right? So self-mastery comes when we can experience the peace amidst the storm, however that may look. And as Jesus commanded, peace be still. And then the wind ceased and the sea was calm. And of course, his famous words during not only physical suffering, but even deeper, emotional and psychological suffering that the betrayal can bring. We know what he said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And so I think perhaps the Greek philosopher known as the father of tragedy, Aeschylus, was right when he said, wisdom comes alone through suffering. So in this moment, I invite us to offer ourselves mercy, grace, gentleness for suffering we've endured and suffering we may still endure. And allow ourselves to take a deep cleansing breath, knowing in our soul that we don't have to be consumed individually or collectively by suffering in any form. And we have the power to transmute this energy into wisdom. So I'd like to take a minute to just move into a prayer and close up here. And however you do that, center into your heart. Let us feel into the gratitude of this moment for this beloved community, recognizing that we are one in the spirit, each one of us a divine design, an individualized expression of the magnificent power and presence of God, here to be the essence of what a lighthouse represents, a guiding light in the darkness, a reminder of safety, of comfort, a reminder of wholeness and peace. We affirm the harmony, intelligence, beauty, wisdom, and joy in the world. If we are having a moment where we can't see or feel this, allow ourselves to touch that space right now within ourselves tenderly, with compassion and gentleness. We offer our healing energy to that feeling out into the world, seeing the fruit of the Spirit nourishing and flourishing. We are grateful to be the light workers, the peace bearers, the love bringers, with hearts full of thanksgiving for the awareness that peace begins with me. And it is already done and complete in the divine and therefore in you, and therefore in me. I release this word into the great expanse of infinite possibilities in love, for love, and as love. And so it is. Ashe. Namaste. Thank you.